today's top boxing news.
We'll start with this per tweet from International Boxing News. McGuigan's Gym has revealed Ellie Scotney will aim to be back in the ring in August. He also revealed that according to her contract, a world title fight is next, per Rob Tebbit.
Rob Tebbit.
It's kind of besides the point. We've known for some time now that Matchroom seemed to be moving Ellie Scotney at a fast rate. For this reason that she faced the former champion in Maria Cecilia Roman in her last fight, in spite of Ellie only having a handful of fights. She exhibits a high ceiling, very skillful young fighter, blue chip prospect that could very well go all the way. Though the idea that she could be fighting for a world title in her very next fight, it does seem a bit ahead of schedule. It does, though at the same time, if Ebony Bridges, who doesn't come from a deep amateur background.
Hey, I mean, she fought for an alphabet title. She fought a world champion, so why can't Ellie?
On the face of it, that might seem like a legitimate question, but the champions you find at 122 pounds might differ from the ones you find at 118 pounds. You're talking about Shernika Johnson, Jamie Mercado, Sigaling Lafarve, Mayerling Rivas. These are not aging champions.
These are younger fighters, younger champions than Maria Roman.
What, you need me to tell you that not all world champions are created equal? That there are differences and nuances in between? Things that need to be accounted for when you're talking about a world title fight for a fighter that only has a handful of fights?
I mean, that's not a knock on anybody. That's just reality.
The reality of it is, Ellie Scotney campaigns at 122 pounds, where New Zealand's own Shernika Johnson holds the IBF, Mexico's own Jamie Mercado holds the WBC, France's own Sigaling Lafarve, she's got the WBO, and Venezuela's Mayerling Rivas holds the WBA. Out of these four champions, I'd say that Mayerling, who Matchroom actually has under contract, she's the apex predator. She's the most experienced fighter, the most experienced champion of the four champions at this weight.
She's the most experienced fighter, the most experienced champion, and the bigger puncher.
Now, I don't know if that's who Ellie Scotney's going to end up fighting, though it's definitely a palpable possibility because she is a Matchroom fighter. I think the most winnable fight for Ellie Scotney, most winnable world title fight she can participate in at 122 pounds would have to be a fight with Yamileth Mercado, Mexico's own WBC champion. You hear it all the time. Styles make fights, and stylistically, in a fight like that, I think Ellie Scotney would have an edge that she perhaps wouldn't have with the other three champions at this weight. Jamie Mercado is durable and strong, a tough nut to crack. She went up there to 126 pounds, took on Amanda Serrano, and while she lost in one-sided fashion, she didn't get dropped and she didn't get stopped.
So she's durable, that much we know, and there's not much chance of Ellie knocking her out.
If Amanda Serrano couldn't knock her out at featherweight, there's not much chance of Ellie knocking her out downstairs at super bantamweight. Better still, Ellie's got the right tools and skills to, at minimum, win a points decision against Jamie Mercado, who doesn't have fast hands or fast feet the same way that Jamie does. Her punches, they're not as accurate.
They're not, and they're pretty wide, easy to counter.
I'd wager that Yamileth Mercado is a more durable fighter than Ellie Scotney, definitely more experienced and a stronger puncher, but as far as ring savvy and ring IQ, that's gotta go to Ellie Scotney. Athleticism as well. I think that, in theory, is the most winnable world title fight Ellie Scotney can participate in. The problem is Matchroom ain't got Jamie Mercado under contract. You know who they do have under contract? They've got Mayerling Rivas, which to me looks like the more dangerous world title fight, the most dangerous world title fight she could have at this weight. The other two champions, Sigaling Lafarve of La France and Shernika Johnson of New Zealand. These are more cerebral fighters, athletic fighters like Ellie Scotney is an athletic fighter. In those situations, those world title fights with those world champions, those are more dicey situations.
It's not saying that Ellie can't beat those fighters in time. In time, perhaps she can, but right now, they're risky.
I think Shernika's got, 15, 16 professional fights? We know Sigaling Lafarve does, whereas Ellie's only got 5 pro fights. And don't confuse how she looked with Maria Cecilia Roman, who was an aging fighter, still is, to how she'd look with them. These two fighters, they're at their physical peak. They are in their physical prime. Very different propositions, very different situations.
Jamie Mercado is the most beatable. Mayerling Rivas is the most dangerous.
But Jamie Mercado may be more expensive. Jamie, who actually fought on the undercard of a Jake Paul fight against Amanda Serrano, who I mentioned earlier. Jamie's more expensive than Mayerling. They actually have Mayerling under contract.
I'd wager it costs less to get Rivas in the ring with Scotney than it would Mercado in the ring with Scotney.
Getting Jamie Mercado in the ring with Ellie Scotney could prove a more expensive proposition. Thus, the realistic fight fight is the Rivas fight. If you ask me, Ali don't need to be fighting for a world title right now. They could probably get her a couple more fights, bit more experience, but if they want to hit the gas on that, I'll tune in.
See what happens.
In men's heavyweight news, Joyce is set to return to action early next month on the 7th. On the undercard, we're going to see Cunningham versus Tete. Zolani Tete, former WBO bantamweight champion Zolani Tete.
Callum Johnson's taking on Igor McAlkin.
Igor's been around the block, been around the world. But he's not a puncher, so you get a good idea based on that what kind of fight this is for Callum Johnson. They're trying to ease him into activity as a result of the Joe Smith Jr. fight's collapse.
Remember, he was supposed to fight Smoking Joe Smith Jr. a couple of months ago, but he contracted COVID.
That was a world title fight, world title opportunity. It's unfortunate for Callum that fight couldn't happen for him. Maybe they can still make a fight between Callum Johnson and Joe Smith Jr., provided Callum makes it through this fight. Still an interesting fight between two tough guys. Two brawlers, two punchers, transatlantic brawlers.
Getting ahead of yourself.
Joyce is supposed to be fighting Christian Hammer. Not a great fight.
I'm going to tune in to watch Christian Hammer get pasted, but it's not a great fight.
But 3 fights ago, he got stopped by Huey Fury. Huey, who we all know, he ain't big on power. He's more of a boxer than a puncher. But he stopped Christian Hammer as part of a Sky Sports boxer show. Afterwards, Christian Hammer lost the decision to Frankie Sanchez.
Lost 2 back-to-back fights, got himself back in the winner's bracket in his last fight.
Against some ham and egg guy with a lot of consonants in his name. Journeyman level opponent. You know the drill.
That gets you a Joyce fight.
Hard to know what the future holds for Joyce, who was supposed to be fighting Joseph Parker, but we all know that fell through. Joseph Parker made the decision to walk away from that fight in order to enter a multi-fight contract with the people over there at Boxer and Sky Sports. It seems that old Fish Eyes Frank Warren jumped the gun announcing that fight. It wasn't done. It wasn't done on paper. Something about Frank Warren changing certain aspects of the contract.
That's according to Joseph Parker. Make of that what you will.
This fight between Smokin' Joe Joyce and Christian Hammer is supposed to be for the WBO International and WBC Silver titles. In that way, it's a fight that could end up moving Joe up those ranks by way of the WBC. He's already in a pole position
By way of the WBO, he's already in a pole position to become their next mandatory challenger.
So you'll notice the addition of that WBC Silver title. The addition of that title comes at a time when they're playing with the idea of Tyson Fury taking on Joyce, I believe, at Wembley.
Well, didn't Tyson Fury say he's retired?
Tyson Fury says a lot of things.
Didn't he say he wants $500 million or 500 million pounds to come out of retirement?
Yeah, something like that. Something about his morality and a sad day should he return to boxing, as he will have compromised his morality, something or other. In any event, that's what they're talking about. That's the idea that they're bouncing around. It's hard to imagine that Tyson Fury would come back for a fight with Smokin' Joe Joyce, which many people might interpret as being a winnable fight, though not exactly worth Tyson Fury's time.
Nah.
Don't ever be fooled. Joyce doesn't have the same marquee value that Dillian Whyte had. Dillian Whyte has been on pay-per-view several times already, sold out the O2 Arena with Joseph Parker. A fight with Joyce doesn't yield the same marquee value as a fight with Dillian Whyte.
It's a good fight. I'd watch it, but it's not as big a fight.
And if it's not as big a fight, it may not be as big a purse for Tyson Fury. Is he going to make all those millions fighting Joyce?
Don't forget how we got there. Don't forget what happened.
The only reason old Fish Eyes Frank Warren ended up pouring all that money into the pot is because Eddie Hearn quite openly stated that he would bid aggressively for the Fury versus Whyte fight in order to bring that fight to the DAZN platform. And as a result of that, Frank Warren thwarted Eddie Hearn's efforts to bring that fight over to DAZN, and he placed a record-winning bid, a huge bid, to keep that fight on BT. That's why that fight ended up costing as much money as it costed.
That wasn't how Frank Warren priced that fight originally. He only did that to make sure the fight stays on BT.
And without Eddie Hearn in the picture to place any kind of a bid in order to inflate the pot, make it a bigger pot as a result of his bid. Just without that situation, what's a fight between Tyson Fury and Joyce really worth? That's a legitimate question. Hell, does the fight even happen? As
Tyson Fury could make more money boxing Francis Ngannou
in a crossover MMA versus boxing match. He could make more money doing that, pasting that guy, than taking a chance on Smokin' Joe Joyce. Is a fight like this to Tyson Fury's fancy? That's a legitimate question. If he takes the fight, it's a decent fight, don't get me wrong, but think about the placement of the fight and when they want to do it. They want to do it in the fall. Well, by the fall, we'll know who the winner of Joshua versus Usyk 2 is.
By that time, people are going to want to see Tyson Fury fight the winner of that fight more than they're going to want to see him fight Joe Joyce.
Won't make any bold proclamations. I don't presume to know how this cookie's going to crumble. Don't know what's going to happen. Fury versus Joyce is actually an interesting fight, but I'd wager that by the time fall gets here, people are going to want to see Tyson Fury vying for the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world a little more than they're going to want to see him fight Joe Joyce.
Fighting Joe Joyce don't take undisputed off the table, though.
If it were to happen that way, the winner of Joshua versus Usyk 2 emerges, regardless of who it is, and Fury still ends up fighting Joe Joyce in the fall anyway, they could always revisit the undisputed heavyweight title fight early next year, though it will give rise to criticism if Fury ends up fighting Joe instead of the winner of that fight, especially if the winner of that fight is Alexander Usyk.
Stylistically, though, this fight's intriguing. Joe's a pressure fighter.
Whereas Tyson Fury has proven to have two base styles, two primarily, the pressure fighter and the pure boxer, the stick and move outside jabber, staying on the perimeter of the ring.
What is he going to use against Joe Joyce?
I'd wager that he would elect to box smoking Joe Joyce, who's not just any old pressure fighter. He's a physically imposing pressure fighter, very durable, took a lot of hard shots from Daniel Dubois, and he didn't wilt. I don't think he's as good a boxer or as nuanced as Tyson Fury, but he's quite the physical specimen, and because of that, I think Fury would elect to box. Walk the guy into shots. Don't look for a knockout. You're not going to get one.
He wouldn't fight fire with fire against Joe Joyce.
Yeah, I don't think so. He didn't do that with Dillian White. He elected to box, depriving him from getting within his sweet spot to let off shots to the body. He moved around the ring, walked the guy into punches, walked the guy into shots. I think he'd do that with Joe Joyce, so he would have a speed advantage.
He's faster than Joe, craftier than Joe. He's ambidextrous.
He can fight southpaw, he can fight orthodox. I think he would elect to box Joe Joyce. Though, for Joe to make it that far, he's got to make it past Christian Hammer early next month. I think he will. I think he's going to splatter that guy.
Don't end up like Junior Fa.
If they serve you up Christian Hammer on a platter, you're supposed to splatter that guy. And I think that that's exactly what Joe Joyce is going to do early next month on the 7th. And we'll see if that leads him into a Tyson Fury WBC title fight. And finally, just in keeping with the theme of heavyweight news, per tweet from Mike Coppinger, the Andy Ruiz versus Luis Ortiz heavyweight fight is set for September 4th in Los Angeles, a PBC on Fox pay-per-view. Ruiz enters the ring with a new trainer for the second time in 2 fights. He's parted ways with Eddie Reynoso and is now led by trainer Alfredo Osuna, highlighting that Manny Robles, when Andy left him, Manny Robles as a trainer wasn't the problem. In truth, I don't think Eddie Reynoso was the problem either, even though it's bad optics.
It's bad optics for Eddie Reynoso as a trainer that Andy, Ryan, and Frankie
Sanchez, Ryan Gersha, Andy Ruiz. It's bad optics for Eddie Reynoso as a trainer that not only have 3 high-profile fighters left his gym, but 2 of his prize stallions lost their last fights, Oscar Valdez, Canelo Alvarez. It's bad optics for Eddie, it is. Though at the same time,
Trainer of the Year to here.
I don't think it's all on Eddie. The inactivity we've been seeing from Andy and how he looked in that Areola fight, I maintain my original position that initially, Manny Robles wasn't Andy Ruiz's problem, here and now. Eddie Reynoso, that wasn't Andy Ruiz's problem either. Andy's got a ticker problem.
A motivation problem, a discipline problem.
Can you believe that he's only fought once since the Anthony Joshua rematch way back when in December of 2019? That's right, he's only fought once in
close to 3 years.
Sat out all of 2020. Only fought once in 2021. He hasn't fought this year yet, though he tried to against Tyrone Spong as part of a Triller card, a Triller show, though he was pulled out of that by his old buddies at the PBC who said he already signed a contract to fight Luis Ortiz. They pulled him out of that Tyrone Spong fight, which he could have had, given how long it's taken to make this fight. This fight got pushed back to September. I vaguely recall hearing it was supposed to go down in August.
He could have had that fight with Tyrone, won that fight, then fought Luis Ortiz.
Although that's assuming Andy would have actually won that fight. Based on how he looked against Chris Areola, your guess is as good as mine as far as who would have won that fight. So Andy hasn't fought.
Andy hasn't been very active. He's only fought once in the last 2, going on 3 years. Something very similar applies to Luis Ortiz.
Luis Ortiz, who was last in action in November of 2020, sat out all of last year, all of 2021, boxed earlier this year, in the beginning, in January, against former IBF champion Charles Martin. In that way,
neither guy's been very active the last 2 years, but at least Luis Ortiz has boxed in the last 12 months.
This is yet another one of Andy Ruiz's fights that's ending up on Fox as a pay-per-view. A pay-per-view, I don't know why, as there isn't a high demand for this fight. Doesn't look like it's a segue to a bigger fight. something bigger.
The only way it's a segue to a bigger fight is if Wilder's really coming back, and we don't know if he is.
He might not. I don't know that this is being billed as an eliminator of some kind by way of the alphabet organizations, the WBC, the WBA, the IBF, and the WBO. These guys are fighting a fight.
Guy's fat and one guy's old.
Really old. That's how he looked against Charles Martin, who he languished with, being dropped 2 times before ultimately stopping the former IBF champion. I will say, Luis Ortiz has the right style to beat Andy Ruiz, who's got fast hands, very quick counters, so he doesn't have fast feet. That's always been his Achilles heel, though at the same time, when you're talking about an aging fighter, an aging heavyweight like Luis Ortiz, are his legs really under him?
They say power is the last thing to go.
But a fighter's legs are the first, and Luis Ortiz is really fucking old.
He's only ever been beat by Deontay Wilder.
Those were 2 knockout losses, you understand, and it's not like Luis Ortiz has kept busy throughout his entire career with the who's who guys of the heavyweight division. Ultimately,
his claim to fame, his claim to quote-unquote elitism is being knocked out by Deontay Wilder 2 times.
this fight is intriguing because it's not a foregone conclusion that Andy and his heavy feet win the fight, though at the same time, it's not a foregone conclusion that Luis Ortiz still has enough in the tank to box his way to a decision, keeping Andy Ruiz on the outside at the end of his southpaw jab. Maybe a younger Luis Ortiz could have been perceived as being the heavy favorite to beat today's Andy Ruiz, but at this age, I don't know that Luis Ortiz really has his legs under him to fight that kind of fight for 12 rounds. Andy's got fast hands, doesn't have fast feet, though he does need to get inside for those fast hands to even come into it. From the outside, he's no good. Can Luis Ortiz keep him out?
I think Luis Ortiz has a better work ethic than Andy Ruiz.
He doesn't have the motivation and discipline issues that Andy has, who let himself balloon in weight ahead of what eventually became the Anthony Joshua rematch, the rematch that he lost in lopsided fashion.
He couldn't get out of bed for that fight, so he's going to get out of bed for this.
Andy didn't want this. He could have had this fight in 2020, back when Luis Ortiz was calling him out.
There's some intrigue in association with this fight, though it's not pay-per-view worthy.
We'll talk more about this fight as the fight date approaches.